Chicago, Illinois, September 23, 1991. The Richard J. Daley Center on Washington Street in the Loop had been built in 1965 from Courtroom steel that had oxidized over the decades into a deep reddish brown. The color of old brick, of dried earth, of something that had weathered a great deal and intended to keep weathering. The building was 31 stories tall and contained within it most of what a city requires to manage its disputes, its inheritances, its demolitions, and its definitions of what counted as valuable enough to protect. Courtroom 1107 on the 11th floor was not the largest room in the building. It held 40 seats in the gallery, a judge's bench of dark oak that had been replaced in 1978 and already looked like it had been there since 1965, a witness stand, 2 counsel tables, and the particular quality of compressed air that courtrooms develop when they have absorbed enough human urgency over enough years. The case on the docket for the morning session of September 23rd was City of Chicago versus Preservation Coalition of the South Side, a civil matter concerning the proposed demolition of a building at 4318 South Indiana Avenue that had housed, since 1947, a blues club called the Blue Monarch. The Blue Monarch was not famous in the way that certain Chicago blues venues were famous. It had not produced the recordings that made chess records legendary, had not been the site of the documented sessions that music historians wrote about, had not been mentioned in the books that sat on the shelves of university libraries under the heading of American music history. Muddy Waters had not recorded there. Howlin' Wolf had not been photographed there. It had not launched careers or changed the direction of a genre. What it had done, for 44 years without interruption or fanfare, was provide a room where a musician could set up on a Tuesday evening and play for 30 people who had come in from the cold, and where those 30 people could hear something that the night required of them without knowing it needed it. A room where the music was not curated or celebrated or presented, just played, the way the blues had always been played before it became something that people argued about in courtrooms. The building at 4318 South Indiana Avenue sat in a block that had seen the kind of change that South Side Chicago blocks see over 50 years, businesses coming and going, buildings rising and falling, the slow metabolism of a neighborhood negotiating its own survival. The Blue Monarch had survived it all by being exactly what it was, a room with good acoustics and a stage 8 inches off the floor, and a man at the door who remembered everyone's name. The city's position, represented by a deputy corporation counsel named Richard Marsh, was that the building was a public hazard. The structural assessment supported this. The electrical systems were 40 years old. The roof had been patched 11 times since 1980. The foundation had shifted. The building needed to come down. The Preservation Coalition's position, represented by an attorney named Sandra Okafor, who had taken the case pro bono because she had heard music at the Blue Monarch 3 times in her life and each time had understood something about herself that she had not understood before, was that the building was culturally significant and that its demolition would constitute an irreplaceable loss to the cultural heritage of the city. The problem with this position, which Sandra Okafor knew very well, was that cultural significance was difficult to quantify in legal terms. You could argue it, you could demonstrate it, you could bring witnesses to testify to it, but you could not enter it into evidence the way you could enter a structural assessment. It lived in the subjective, which courts were designed to manage but not required to honor. Judge Patricia Carver was 58 years old, had been on the bench for 14 years, and had the particular manner of a person who has heard a very large number of arguments about a very large number of things, and has developed a corresponding skepticism about the importance of any single argument. She was not unkind. She was efficient. She believed that the law was a tool for resolving disputes in an orderly way, and that sentiment, while understandable, was not the law's primary concern. She had reviewed the structural assessments. They were thorough and well documented. She was inclined toward the city's position before the morning session began, which was not the same as having decided but was close. Richard Marsh made his argument in 45 minutes. He was 44 years old, a 12-year veteran of the Corporation Counsel's office, and he approached the case with the professional thoroughness of someone who believed genuinely in the city's position and was not merely representing it. The structural assessments were real. The liability was real. Buildings fell down. People were hurt. The city had a responsibility. He cited the assessments in detail. The foundation shift documented in 1988 and again in 1990. The electrical panels that predated current safety codes by 3 decades. The roof repairs that had addressed symptoms rather than causes. He cited 3 comparable cases in which similar structures had been ordered demolished on similar grounds, each with its own community opposition, each upheld on appeal. He cited the 1987 Illinois appellate ruling that had established the standard for balancing structural safety against cultural preservation claims, and had found in that case for the structural safety argument. He noted the city's liability exposure in the event of a structural failure. He was thorough. He was convincing. He sat down with the quiet confidence of a man who has done what he came to do and believes it was worth doing. Sandra Okafor made her argument in 30 minutes. She was 37 years old, a partner at a civil rights firm on Michigan Avenue, and she had taken this case because 3 times in her life she had heard music at the Blue Monarch that had done something to her that she could not fully articulate, and had spent 11 years deciding she did not need to articulate. She just needed to protect the room where it had happened. She spoke about the history of Chicago blues, the great migration from the Mississippi Delta that had brought hundreds of thousands of African American families to the South Side between 1915 and 1970, the music they had carried with them, the music they had made when they arrived, the way the blues had functioned not as entertainment but as a community language, a shared vocabulary for shared experience. She spoke about what the Blue Monarch had meant to the community it served for 44 years. Not as a landmark, not as a tourist attraction, but as a room where people came when they needed something that rooms like this provided. She brought photographs from 1952, 1963, 1971, 1988, the room the same in each, the faces different, the purpose continuous. She brought a petition signed by 400 residents. She brought a letter from the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs acknowledging the club's historical and cultural significance. She brought a letter from a music historian at the University of Chicago. Judge Carver received all of it with the attentive neutrality she brought to everything. She asked 3 questions of Marsh about the structural timeline and 2 of Okafor about the preservation alternative costs. She made notes in the careful, complete handwriting she had used since law school. Then she said, "Ms. Okafor, you have witnesses listed. Let's proceed." The first 2 witnesses were community members, an elderly woman who had been attending the Blue Monarch since 1952, and a musician named Thomas Webb who had been playing there since 1978. Both testified with evident sincerity. Judge Carver listened, made notes, and remained neutral. Then Sandra Okafor said, "The coalition calls its final witness, B.B. King." The gallery, which had been the particular quiet of a courtroom, an audience that knows it is not supposed to be an audience, produced a sound. Not loud. The involuntary intake of breath that a group of people makes when something arrives that they were not expecting. Judge Carver looked up from her notes. She looked at the witness stand. She looked at Sandra Okafor. "Mr. King," she said after a moment. B.B. King walked from the back of the gallery to the witness stand. He was 66 years old, large and broad-shouldered, wearing his deep royal blue jacquard-patterned silk brocade shirt with its gold detail, dark trousers, good shoes, dressed the way he dressed for every significant occasion, which was to say with care and without apology for the care. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has been in a great many rooms over 66 years and has never found it necessary to hurry in any of them. He carried Lucille's case in his left hand. He set it beside the witness stand with the particular care he always used with it, not ostentatiously, just the habitual attention of a man who has carried the same case for 30 years and does not set it down carelessly. He settled into the witness chair. He was sworn in by the clerk, his right hand raised, his voice saying, "I do," with the same tone he used for everything, warm, unhurried, certain. Richard Marsh, at the city's table, looked at the guitar case beside the witness stand. Then he looked at Judge Carver. His expression remained professionally composed, but something had shifted in it, the particular shift of a man who has prepared thoroughly for a proceeding and has just encountered a variable he did not prepare for. Sandra Okafor approached the witness stand. "Mr. King," she said, "thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," BB said. His voice in the courtroom had its full register, the warm bass that filled a room without effort. "Can you tell the court what the Blue Monarch means to you?" BB looked at the judge, then at the gallery, then back at Sandra Okafor. "I played there in 1953, he said, "and in 1957, and 4 more times after that." He paused. "Every time I played that room, I played better than I played anywhere else, because that room listened differently." He was quiet for a moment. There are rooms that hear music and rooms that just let it happen. The Blue Monarch is a room that hears it. Marsh stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is subjective testimony with no bearing on the structural question before the court." "Sustained," Judge Carver said. "Mr. King, can you speak to the specific cultural and historical significance in terms that—" "Your Honor," Sandra Okafor said, "I'd like to make a request. I'd like to request that Mr. King be permitted to demonstrate, rather than describe, what the Blue Monarch represents. I'd like him to play." The courtroom was completely quiet. Marsh was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This is a court of law, not a—" "Mr. Marsh," Judge Carver said, her voice had not changed in tone, "I am aware of what this is." She looked at B.B. King. She looked at the guitar case. She looked at Sandra Okafor. She was 58 years old. She had grown up in Hyde Park, 4 blocks from the University of Chicago, in a house where her father had played records every Sunday afternoon, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Sonny Boy Williamson. She had not thought about those Sunday afternoons in a long time. She thought about them now. "I'll allow it," she said. "Mr. Marsh, your objection is noted for the record." Marsh sat down. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at them. B.B. King opened Lucille's case. He lifted her out. The pitch-black Gibson ES 355, gold hardware, the guitar he had played every day since 1958. He held her for a moment, adjusting his position in the witness chair. He looked out at the courtroom. 40 people in the gallery, Judge Carver on the bench, court reporter at her machine, Marsh at his table with his folded hands, Sandra Okafor standing to the side with an expression that could not quite be called calm. BB played one note. The note bent upward and held with the vibrato that had defined 40 years of American blues. Not a style, not a technique, but a voice. A human voice speaking through a guitar string in the particular language that has no translation because the translation is the feeling itself. In the gallery, the elderly woman who had been coming to the Blue Monarch since 1952 pressed her hands together. The court reporter stopped typing. BB played into the blues. A slow 12-bar, unhurried, the way he played when the room required honesty rather than performance. Each note given its full space. Each phrase building on the last with the patience of something that has been saying the same thing for 100 years, because the thing is still true and still needs to be said. He played for 7 minutes. When he lifted his hand, and the last note faded in courtroom 1107, The Richard J. Daley Center was quiet in a way that it had likely never been quiet before, in the particular way that quiet arrives when something has taken the air out of every other consideration and replaced it with itself. Judge Carver sat on her bench and said nothing for a long moment. She looked at her notes. She looked at B.B. King in the witness stand with Lucille across his lap. She looked at the gallery, at the faces of 40 people who had come to a legal proceeding and had received something else. "Mr. Marsh," she said finally. Marsh looked up. "Your structural assessments," she said. "They address the building as it currently stands. Do they assess the cost of restoration?" Marsh hesitated. "The city's position has been that restoration is not cost-effective." "That's not what I asked," the judge said. "Do they assess the cost of restoration?" "No, Your Honor." Judge Carver looked at her notes for another moment. "I'm going to order a 30-day continuance," she said, "during which time I am directing the city to commission a full restoration feasibility assessment of 4318 South Indiana Avenue." She looked at both attorneys. "When we reconvene, I want numbers, not positions. Numbers." She paused. "Court is in recess." She stood, everyone stood. At the door to her chambers, Judge Carver stopped. She had not intended to stop, but she stopped. She looked back at B.B. King, who was returning Lucille to her case with the care he always used, the same care at the end of a performance as at the beginning. She said nothing. She went into her chambers. The restoration assessment, delivered 26 days later, found that the Blue Monarch could be structurally restored for a figure significantly lower than the city had estimated. A coalition of private donors, organized in the weeks following the hearing by 3 people who had been in the gallery on September 23rd, had already pledged half the required amount before the assessment was delivered. The city, reviewing the revised numbers and the revised political landscape that tends to form around buildings that have received the kind of attention the Blue Monarch received in the weeks following the hearing, agreed to a restoration plan rather than demolition. The Blue Monarch reopened on April 14, 1993, after 7 months of restoration work that had been done carefully, with attention to the original materials and the original character of the room, not rebuilt into something new, but repaired into something continuous with what it had been. The stage was still 8 inches off the floor. The acoustics were still what they had always been. The man at the door still remembered everyone's name because it was the same man. At the opening night, B.B. King played. He played for 2 hours to a room that was full from the first note to the last, on South Indiana Avenue in Chicago on a warm April evening. He played the blues the way he had always played it, with complete honesty and without explanation, and the room heard him the way it had always heard music, differently from other rooms, with the particular attention of a place that has been listening for 44 years and has decided it intends to keep listening for 44 more. Judge Patricia Carver was not at the opening. She had a previous commitment that evening, but she heard about it from the court reporter who had been there, who called her the next morning to tell her. She listened to the description. She thanked the court reporter. She hung up the phone. She sat in her office for a moment. Then she pulled open her desk drawer and took out a record she had not listened to in 40 years, Muddy Waters, Chess Records, 1950, the copy her father had kept and that she had inherited without knowing quite why she had kept it. She put it in her bag to take home. Some things that have been set aside for a long time are still there when you go back for them. That is what the blues has always known. That is why it has always been worth protecting. If you have ever fought for something that mattered, a place, a piece of music, a piece of who you are, drop it in the comments. I read every one. And which B.B. King song has never left you? The blues is the truth, and the truth is worth a fight. B.B. King.